If you never played the old Resident Evil games back in the day, well, it's something that's kind of a hard sell nowadays. Newer gamers might not find these old games so appealing, but there is something kind of nostalgic about those clunky mechanics, the story and the writing and the familiarity of those environments and locations.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Something about those old pre-rendered backgrounds juxtaposed with blocky and pixelated 3D character models just screams nostalgia to me. When you get a bunch of people in the same place who also feel the same way and happen to be game developers trying to recapture that feeling, what you get is Daymare 1998.
It's about time you guys got here.
A survival horror game that self-describes itself as recreating the mood of iconic titles from the 1990s. And you know how there's been so many FPS throwbacks lately with games like Dusk, Amid Evil and Iron Maiden? Yeah, well, Daymare is doing for survival horror what those games did for retro FPS. It's been out for a couple of days now on Steam with barely anyone talking about it. Probably because that niche of purposefully antiquated old school survival horror just ain't the biggest draw. Now, Daymare's story is broken up between three main characters. You've got Special Forces soldier Liv, a chopper pilot named Raven, and then some poor asshole named Sam. A Firewatch who just happened to get caught up in the whole shitstorm when the nearby town is attacked.
Sorry, I must have passed out. Hell of a nightmare, too.
The campaign shifts back and forth between these characters, showing events from different perspectives as they've all got their own goals and motivations for escaping. Sam's probably the most interesting character out of the bunch. He's got some sort of medical condition that, among other things, causes him to hallucinate, often even hallucinating seeing zombies coming towards him. Though this ends up to be a complete pain in the ass because you end up wasting ammo on these things, because you can't even tell if they're not real until you shoot them. Other than that though, each character pretty much seems to be the same. Like, they all run at the same speed, they shoot at the same speed, and they seem to have the same health points. Different characters get different weapons, but there aren't huge differences. I mean, Raven's Beretta seems to do as much damage as Sam's Glock does. At the center of all of this though is the Hexacore Company, which is Daymare's version of Umbrella Corporation. And it shouldn't really come as a shock that these are the guys responsible for the outbreak, or so it seems.
I've been trying to reconstruct exactly what went wrong.
Whatever they're doing is what seems to be what caused the zombies to be created, along with all the other horrid monsters that have come out of these mutations.
That's right. A real nasty son of a bitch indeed.
All three characters will often visit the same locations, just played in different orders and accessing different areas as you uncover what's happened. You also visit all of the sort of locations you'd expect too. You've got top secret labs, city streets, the sewers, and a hospital. It's textbook stuff. The third chapter is the closest you could get to a recreated Raccoon City from Resident Evil 3, without it actually being that game.
That's right.
Puzzles are spread throughout the campaign and made up of things mostly involving trial and error. But they can also get pretty tricky and in-depth as well. Like, one puzzle is a passcode that requires the player to translate a message in Morse code. And yeah, that's about as time consuming and honestly frustrating as you might think. This is a par for the course lineup of weapons too, so for starters you've got a pistol, which you really need to go for headshots with, and even then it becomes pretty much useless, unless something is at range. Then there's the old chestnut, the shotgun, and I mean, would it really be survival horror without a shotgun? And as you'd expect, the best way to use this thing is to wait until an enemy is pretty much right on top of you to maximize the damage it does. And if you're lucky, you'll take their head clean off. Lastly, there's Daymare's version of the Magnum, which is a revolver for Sam and a Desert Eagle for Raven. Liv also does get an MP5, but it's not as useful as you might hope, and it just does really piss poor damage. The only benefit it really has is the larger magazine size. What I was a bit bummed out about though was the complete lack of options in upgrading any of the weapons. Finding the upgrades for the shotgun and the Magnum in RE2 for instance made a huge impact in the second half of the game. And unless I missed it, there's no kind of rocket or grenade launcher either, and those are both staples of the Resident Evil series. There's also a lack of melee weapons too, though melee combat is kinda tricky because most zombies grab onto you like complete dickheads. All in all, the shooting is okay, I guess. You really do have to go for headshots in this game almost exclusively and juggle around the different ammo types effectively. I did notice some pretty crappy hit detection here and there, especially with the shotgun, where it just felt like a shot should have been more impactful, but I don't know if this was due to my aim or just the timing of when I fired it. Either way, it didn't feel as refined as I'd like, but you know what, I'm willing to cut it slack in that regard because overall, it's pretty solid. The violence and the gore is pretty good, and you get some nice bits of dismemberment here and there too. I mean, look, if we can't take a little time out of our day to appreciate taking a zombie's head off with the shotgun, I mean, what's the point of living? One of the more unique things Daymare does though is its reloading mechanic. Now, so reloading a weapon isn't just about pressing the reload button and having enough spare ammo in your inventory. Nah son, what you need to do is open up your inventory and manually combine ammo with the spare magazine. If you don't have a spare magazine, you have to go into your inventory and instead combine the ammo with the weapon itself. This sounds fine, but unlike the Resident Evil games, opening up your inventory doesn't pause the game world around you. Everything continues moving around. With spare magazines, you can either do a fast or a slow reload. Now, a fast reload, your character's just going to drop the magazine on the ground. A slow reload is going to take longer and you can't sprint when you're doing it, but instead you'll put that magazine right back into your inventory and the fresh one is ready to go. I think the idea is that if you're under pressure, you can reload much faster and just come back later to pick up that dropped magazine. Now look, inventory management is fine, but when you gotta stop almost every single time you find an ammo box to manually combine it with a weapon magazine, it starts to create this very sporadic experience. The flow of the game is constantly stopping as you bugger around in your inventory, and there's just such a delay between opening up your inventory and combining that ammo. As far as I can remember, I don't recall any of those old classic survival horror games forcing you to manually load bullets into a magazine. Resident Evil 3 lets you craft your own ammo, but this took all of 5 seconds, and you still didn't have to manually load each magazine yourself. It's something that seems like a neat idea initially, but it just becomes so tedious later in the game. And they bypass this mechanic entirely in the boss fights by just putting down these containers that have infinite, already fully loaded magazines. By the end of these boss fights, there's like a dozen empty magazines lying all over the ground. It looks stupid.
Huh. You don't say.
Daymare's whole MO is that it's trying to capture that feeling of what old survival horror games were like. You know what I mean? That being the clunkiness of the interface and the movement controls. And if that was their intention, well, they did a bang-up job. But this kind of thing might alienate and piss off a lot of players.
Surprise, motherfucker!
For starters, every character in this game moves so slowly. Every single action from opening doors, pulling up your inventory, and simply swapping out weapons is so labored. The simple action of just swapping from a pistol to a shotgun takes so long, you'd think it's some kind of Tai Chi exercise. And look, that's fine, I get it. Old survival horror games used to be as clunky as an elderly woman with a peg leg. But those games have since realised those shortcomings and they've moved on from that. They were clunky because they didn't really know any better at the time. There was no alternative. In the same way that we used to play first-person shooters using the directional buttons to move and spacebar to open doors.
This isn't happening.
What also doesn't help is that the game often seems to flat out ignore your inputs. I often found myself having to mash the sprint or the reload button before it would kick in. This is made even more annoying when you're trying to evade enemies because Daymare, like all zombie games, does that stupid shit where everything just grabs onto you, forcing a button mash to get them off. Then there's the boss fights, and man, some of these are just atrocious. Visually, I think a lot of these boss fights are really cool, and there's always some kind of awesome music in the background. But I just don't think it's that much fun anymore, fighting bosses that can survive dozens of magnum rounds to the face, shooting some big bastard in the head whilst running around and dealing with your character's infuriatingly slow movement speed. The last boss in the game literally survived like 50 or so Desert Eagle rounds before dying. And on some level, I think that developers knew this because they put in all these ammo boxes that all have infinite magazines for the player to pick up. It also raises another issue, which is, what's the point of having super powerful guns like this, and then making it so I've still got to shoot an enemy 50 times with it? You may as well just force me to use the starting pistol instead. And even then, like, I don't remember all those old bosses being that spongy. Like in RE2, you could kill bosses with half a dozen shots from the Magnum. I think a lot of the other issues Daymare has do stem from the fact that despite how hard it tries, it really is a AAA wannabe in an indie game's clothing. And a good example of this too is some aspects of the visuals. Some of the character models in the game are pretty bad, like Sam's beard for instance often looks like it's a fake beard that's been glued to his face. The weird part too is that the zombie models generally look really good and are just animated superbly. Like seeing a zombie slowly fall to its knees after catching 3 bullets with its face is super impressive. To the point too that when it's raining, the zombies look believably wet, but then the main characters just kinda look odd.
That's unfortunate.
Running in the Unreal 4 engine, which comes as a shock to nobody, the lighting is also amazing. But there's one section in the game that takes place during the day, and this whole bit honestly looks last gen. It reminded me a lot of some areas in Soldier of Fortune Payback, and if you haven't played that game, well, let me say that it's not a good comparison to make. I mean, like, look at this waterfall.
That's unfortunate.
Still, it is kinda hard to fault Daymare considering what it set out to achieve. It's trying to be a throwback, capturing those archaic and antiquated aspects of what made those old games so captivating, and wearing those influences on its sleeve. And I guess on that note, that's something that it does really well. So complaining about it's like going out to play tennis, and then complaining that you've got to use a tennis racket instead of a hockey stick. I guess my point is, I don't think this game is for everyone. There's two difficulty modes to play on. You've got Beginner and Daymare, which is the mode the developers suggest you go with. And on this mode, you'll always be scrimping by for health and ammo. You'll be narrowly avoiding death and generally moving around with a puckered asshole, scared out of your wits. But that's everything that they're trying to go for, and when the whole thing clicks, you know what? It's pretty fucking awesome. It's a shame that there's no kind of New Game Plus mode or unlockable weapons or anything like that. Going back through those old games with some kind of stupidly powerful gun or a skimpy costume for one of the female characters is what made some of those old games so much fun.
Understood?
Yes, sir!
My first playthrough took me about 10 hours, give or take. So for 38 buckaroos, that ain't too bad, and you are supporting indie devs, which is always a good thing. There's no microtransactions. The game's available on Steam and not the Epic Game Store. And Electronic Arts, Todd Howard and Randy Pitchford aren't involved at all. So people can drop their pitchforks, play the game and evaluate the game for what it is. And for those people who can understand what it's trying to do, well, I think you'll have a hell of a time.
Oh, what the heck. I'll lend a hand.